Sarah was the youngest in a family of 5. There was her father, a man who spoke little but whose silence seemed to carry a weight that filled the room. Her mother was the opposite, always talking, always busy, as if every moment of stillness was something to avoid. Then there were her 2 older brothers, Adam and Lucas. Adam was the one who did everything right, according to their parents anyway. He followed the rules, went to school, and got good grades. Lucas, on the other hand, was a different story. He seemed to do everything wrong. Late nights, trouble with school, and arguments with her father that made Sarah wish she could disappear into the walls. Sarah herself was often the observer. She watched the way her family seemed to exist like separate pieces of something, never quite fitting together, like mismatched furniture in a room that nobody bothered to arrange. It wasn't that they didn't care about each other, they just didn't seem to know how to fit together. Her father would come home from work, nod at her in the hallway, and disappear into the garage where he would tinker with something mechanical. Something that didn't ask questions or have emotions. Her mother was always in the kitchen, even when no one was hungry, as if the act of stirring something in a pot would somehow keep everything from falling apart. And Adam, well, Adam was like a constant reminder of everything Lucas wasn't, which only made Lucas push back harder. For a long time, Sarah wondered why her family felt so frayed, why they couldn't just be like the families she saw in movies, where things got messy but always came together in the end. But that wasn't their reality. One evening, after another argument between her father and Lucas, Sarah sat at the dining room table, a place where meals were usually eaten in silence. She pecked at the tablecloth, a threadbare piece that had been in their house as long as she could remember. It was white once, now it was stained and faded, but still, it was there, like everything else in their house, worn out, but not quite broken. Her mother was in the kitchen, pots clanging, and her father was outside, probably with the car engine. Adam was upstairs doing homework, or pretending to, and Lucas had stormed out earlier, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. Sarah sat alone, looking at that tablecloth, and for some reason, she thought of a story she once heard in school about a piece of fabric. Her teacher had said something about how each thread was important, how they all had to work together to make the whole thing strong. Without one thread, the fabric could start to unravel, and then, little by little, it would all come apart. "Lucas," she said, her voice low but clear, "do you ever wonder why we can't just get along?" He stopped, surprised by her question. He stood there, looking down at her, as if he didn't know how to answer. Finally, he shrugged. "It's just the way things are." Sarah frowned. But it doesn't have to be. We're all part of the same family, right? Like threads in the same fabric. If one of us pulls too hard, the whole thing could fall apart." Lucas leaned against the doorframe, his eyes tired but thoughtful. "Maybe the fabric's already falling apart," he said. For the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake that thought. Was their family really like a piece of fabric that was unraveling, bit by bit? It felt like it sometimes, like they were all hanging by a thread, and no one was doing anything to fix it. Her father stayed in the garage longer each night, her mother grew quieter, and Adam just seemed to drift along, as if he didn't see what was happening one night. As the tension in the house reached its peak, Sarah decided to talk to her father. It was a quiet evening, her mother had gone to bed early, and Lucas was out again. Adam was in his room as usual. She found her father in the garage, sitting on an old stool, staring at a broken radio. He didn't look up when she entered, he grunted in response, still focused on the radio. Do you think we're falling apart?" He paused, his hands resting on the radio. For an moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he spoke. Sometimes, he admitted, his voice low and steady. "But that doesn't mean we can't fix it." Sarah felt a flicker of hope. "But how? It feels like we're all pulling in different directions, like we're all pieces that don't fit." Her father looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, a kind of understanding. "It's like this radio," he said, tapping the old rusted thing on the workbench. "It's broken now, but it's not beyond repair. Just takes time and effort to get the parts working together again. Sometimes you have to rebuild from the inside out." Over the next few weeks, things didn't magically get better. Lucas still argued with her father, and her mother still spent too much time in the kitchen. But Sarah noticed small changes. Her father started coming inside earlier. Her mother began sitting with them at the table, even when no one was talking. And Lucas didn't slam the door as hard when he came home late. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. One night, as they sat together at the dinner table, Sarah looked around at her family. The conversation was sparse, but it was there. Her father asked Adam about school, her mother asked Lucas about work. It was small talk, but it was more than they'd had in a long time. And then, almost without thinking, Sarah reached out and touched the tablecloth. The same old, worn tablecloth that had been there for as long as she could remember. She ran her fingers over the fray edges and smiled. thinking again about that piece of fabric, about how every thread mattered, even the ones that were a little worn or out of place. Because in the end, it wasn't about being perfect. It was about holding together even when it felt like everything was coming apart. It was about understanding that sometimes things needed to be mended, and sometimes they just needed to be held on to. The moral wasn't something grand or profound. It was simple, really. Families were like fabric, they could fray, they could wear thin, but with care and effort, they could hold together. Even when the edges started to unravel, as long as there was a thread to hold on to, they wouldn't fall apart completely. In the end, it wasn't about fixing every tear or hiding every flaw. It was about recognizing the value of the threads, even the ones that seemed like they didn't belong. Because every thread mattered, and sometimes the ones that seemed weakest were the ones holding everything together.